Many researchers in the Southwest and elsewhere have suggested that climatic stresses can trigger intergroup conflict. But sometimes it is more important and beneficial for people to cooperate in the face of adversity rather than compete. The Flagstaff area provides an excellent case study to examine these possibilities. 3 lines of evidence can be used to infer intergroup violence archaeologically: the presence of defensive sites, skeletal evidence of trauma and violence, and the emergence of warrior roles in institutions. Defensive sites are evidence of hostilities, as decisions to make investments in fortifications are motivated by the frequency and predictability of conflict. If conflict resulting in the potential loss of persons or property was frequent and predictable, then investments in defense should be expected. Typical fortifications impede the access of attackers using walls and natural features. Building on top of natural features like rock outcrops, mesas, or hills could enhance the defender's advantage of height over their attackers. In research done in a neighboring area, Julie Solometto differentiated between 2 types of defensive sites: defensive retreats and fortified habitations. Defensive retreats were simply places of refuge during times of trouble and lack features for permanent habitation or storage. In contrast, fortified habitations have evidence of permanent habitation and storage. Rather than being infrequently used refuges, fortified habitations provided constant security for persons and property. Before the eruption, local populations lived in dispersed clusters of pit houses, and the only defensive sites were in the frontier zone, where pottery and architectural styles suggest cultural mixing of Sinawa and the neighboring Kohonina. While sites with mixed architectural and pottery styles indicate that interaction in the frontier zone was primarily peaceable, the presence of defensive retreats suggests occasional tensions. Medicine Fort and Dead Man Fort were large, one-room structures with thick walls built in the AD 1050s on prominent hills overlooking local travel routes. Medicine Fort had 3 storage rooms added after its initial construction, perhaps indicating changing needs to secure stored resources from destruction or plunder. The site burned catastrophically in the mid-1060s. Immediately after the eruption, there do not appear to have been any defensive sites. In the post-eruptive refugium, clusters of pit houses are densely packed around ball court sites, but there is no evidence of fortifications or conflict. After the 1130s mega-drought, fortified habitations and defensive refuges become common, especially in the frontier zone. However, most habitation sites throughout these times remain largely indefensible. After AD 1220, populations aggregated into fewer and larger sites, some of which were fortified habitations. These include some of the largest sites ever built in the area, and the site with the latest cutting date from the area, AD 1276. Again, however, some habitation sites were not defensible, but pottery suggests that the latest occupied ones were. Strawberry Crater is a volcanic feature that erupted long before human occupation of the area, and its steep sides easily limited access and made it an excellent location for a defensive retreat. 2 defensive walls block access to 2 sheltered rooms on the interior rim of the crater, 400 feet higher than the surrounding land. These rooms have no evidence of associated trash indicating habitation, nor any storage features. A lookout is perched at the top, where the frontier zone along Dead Man Wash to the north could be monitored. Field houses and small unit pueblos dating to the early 1100s are found on the ash-mulched fields to the west of the crater, and the retreat may have been used by these colonists seeking arable land in the ashfall zone. New Caves Pueblo is a fortified habitation built and occupied after AD 1250. Numerous habitation and storage features were built on the summit of a crater and in the saddle below. Cavate storage rooms and subfloor storage cellars were excavated into the welded cinders of the crater. These provided substantial, secured storage for agricultural produce, all of which would have had to have been carried to the top. A defensive wall limited access to the summit, which Harold Colton dubbed the Acropolis, inferring it to be the redoubt of last resistance. Recent work by Kathy Camp and John Whitaker suggests that the site may have begun as a defensive retreat that expanded to include habitation. The summit is 700 feet above the fertile farmlands at the base of the crater and along the Rio de Flag nearby. Reaching the various habitation and storage structures in the saddle below the summit required an arduous climb of over 400 feet. From their high location atop O'Neill Crater, the site's occupants could see several other fortified habitations: Old Caves, Turkey Tanks, NA 3999, and Piper Crater Fort, and some defensive retreats, Fortress Hills and NA 474. While some of the fortified habitations fell out of use as new caves grew, Turkey Tanks and NA 3999, others like Old Caves and Piper Crater Fort also grew. These line-of-sight networks could have aided the ability to easily and rapidly communicate among sites in order to sound an alarm to threats and coordinate defenses. These connections also imply political integration of local populations. Tremendous investments are needed to construct fortified sites, especially those built on top of high points. Not only are labor and materials needed, but additional transportation costs are added. Fortified habitations also add additional costs to daily life, as all food, firewood, and water would have to be carried up to the habitation, and more time would be added to the commute to and from agricultural fields. All of the late fortified habitations in the heartland, New Caves, Old Caves, and Piper Crater, were on top of 400-foot-high hilltops. To make such extraordinary efforts implies a strong perception of need, driven by real fears of violence to persons and property. What created these fears, and were they justified? Several sites with skeletal evidence of violence have been excavated in the area, and two stand out for the extreme levels of violence employed. First is a small unit pueblo in the frontier zone named House of Tragedy by its excavator, Watson Smith. The mutilated remains of a young man and a young woman were found on the floor of the pit structure, which was then burned. The dismembered leg of another adult male was found in a burned room of the pueblo. The broken and disarticulated but unburned bones of at least two individuals were gathered and buried in an extramural storage pit, perhaps deposited by relatives of the deceased at a later point after hostilities had subsided. Dead Man Edge is named for its proximity to Dead Man Wash. This drainage and the nearby Dead Man Mesa were along the frontier zone, and while their modern name resulted from a suspected rustler found dead in the 1880s, it may seem appropriate for the prehistoric period as well. 5 individuals were found on the floor of a burned pit house at this site. One was partially stuffed into a subfloor storage pit, and 2, maybe 3, appear to have been bound to the upright roof support posts. Like at House of Tragedy, the occupants at Dead Man Edge seem to have been tortured, killed, and burned inside of their home. Was the violence associated with periods of environmental stress? Several researchers have suggested that declines in productivity and resulting food shortages would create social stresses leading to intergroup conflict. There are two excavated examples of violence before the eruption, when people lived in dispersed settlements of pit houses. Both have individuals in burned pit houses within partially burned settlements. Neither of these was occupied during periods of environmental stress. In fact, the Jack Smith tank site was occupied during an optimal climatic period. It was also near a contemporaneous defensive retreat. Rather than being related to climate, conflict before the eruption appears to have been part of cultural interactions that contested the boundaries between groups in the frontier zone. There is no evidence of any intergroup violence immediately following the eruption of Sunset Crater, but during the AD 1131 to 1142 megadrought, there was an explosion of fierce violence, including the aforementioned incidences at the House of Tragedy and Dead Man Edge. In these incidences, there is evidence of mutilation of the bodies, either before or shortly after death, perhaps as torture inflicted upon the victims. Such mutilation was not associated with the pre-eruption incidences of conflict. Other researchers in different parts of the Southwest have called these extreme processing events and suggest that they are found during periods when violence was escalated and deliberately employed to create a climate of fear. These incidences may be associated with witchcraft accusations and executions. Southwestern ethnographies indicate that witches were severely abused and often burned. Further, whole families could be targeted by those seeking vengeance for perceived assaults. Traditional cultures of the Southwest also didn't see drought as a natural event, but rather something often caused by witchcraft. Social stresses triggered by the drought were likely expressed culturally as episodes of witchcraft accusations and executions. In the frontier zone, tensions would have been elevated by the competition for land, and newly arrived non-local peoples may have been targeted. All of the sites with evidence of violence in the frontier zone have pottery assemblages dominated by non-local plainwares, suggesting colonists coming from west of the peaks and from across the Little Colorado River. During the megadrought, it seems that the abilities of ball court rituals to mediate tensions were exceeded. Violence erupted, and ball courts fell out of use. Later evidence of violence is limited to formal burials with evidence of scalping and additional trauma. The example from Upaki dates to the late 1100s, while both Turkey Hill and Two Kivas date after 1220. In general, scalping and the taking of war trophies is tied to marking and validating warrior status, and scalps were used to obtain power over one's vanquished enemies. In the Southwest, the powers of scalps were also associated with fertility and rain. The evidence of trophy-taking behaviors suggests increasing formalization and social recognition of warrior roles and statuses. The formal burials afforded these victims also suggest the high esteem in which they were held by their communities.
The occurrence of violence and use of fortifications can be indexed in order to measure changes in the frequency or intensity. I created a skeletal violence index that measures the annualized frequency of occurrence of violence in relation to the total number of excavated burials for different time periods. Similarly, I measured the annualized frequency of fortification use in relation to the total number of recorded sites for the same time periods. Violence increased dramatically during the megadrought, leading to increased use of fortifications. While violence still occurred, the investments in fortifications do appear to have been successful in defense against attacks in prevented the levels of violence found during the megadrought.
In other areas of the Southwest, rock art and kiva murals of shield-bearing warriors provide iconographic evidence of warriors and the emergence of formalized social roles and institutions associated with the management and prosecution of intergroup conflict. Unfortunately, these are not found in the Flagstaff area. However, the emergence of such roles and institutions is expressed in the burial of the magician. Several of the groups of offerings suggest formalized social roles related to intergroup conflict, most centrally the swallowing sticks. At Hopi, these stick-swallowing rites were associated with the Momtsi warrior sodality, into which all young men were initiated. Other formal social roles related to weather control, curing, divination, and calendrical knowledge are represented in the offering groups, which were segregated into different balanced and complementary roles. These offering groups confirmed the ritual and political constitution of the society when the mortuary rites for the magician distributed these social roles among his successors. These interpretations would suggest that by the time the magician was interred around AD 1180, roles related to intergroup conflict were institutionalized and played an important part in the social order. Intergroup conflict was probably closely associated with male initiation and status achievement, and thus came to be embedded in social processes independent of subsistence and potential stresses from environmental disturbances.
There was not always a strong relationship between periods of environmental stress and intergroup conflict. No violence was associated with the AD 1085 to 1101 eruption and drought. Rather, new ball courts were built and used, perhaps to mediate social tensions among the refugees and their hosts. In contrast, the AD 1131 to 1142 megadrought is associated with incidences of extreme violence in the frontier zone. Competition for lands as the frontier zone was resettled may have led outsiders to be targeted when social stresses escalated during the megadrought. The levels of violence employed may have been culturally justified through witchcraft accusations made by the victors against their victims. In the aftermath of these attacks, which likely triggered reprisals, many fortified habitations were built and occupied, suggesting the emergence of a climate of fear and increased threats to persons and property. Fortifications appear to have achieved their goal of increased security as the levels of violence decreased. The offerings in the burial of the magician indicate that by the AD 1180s, intergroup conflict was institutionalized and associated with male status achievement. As such, conflict was embedded in different social processes and perhaps uncoupled from subsistence and climate. Still, the violence perpetrated during the megadrought seems to have created a social context where fortifications were seen as essential by many in the area and fostered the development of leadership roles related to the management and prosecution of intergroup conflict. Violence also appears to have been used as a boundary marking behavior, both before the eruption during optimal climatic periods and afterwards during the megadrought.